Hello everyone, I'm Cody Bonds and welcome to a very special subscriber requested video. Today we're going to take a look at the Warhammer fantasy world, which is basically history turned to 11. If you're unaware, Warhammer was created by Games Workshop, a British company back in the 1980s, but has raised to prominence more recently with Total War Warhammer, which you can see some other videos for on this channel. But the source material behind who you can play as, the races in the game, is directly pulled from history. It's just history on steroids. You really don't have to look any further than the map of the world itself. It's a stylized version of the world. You've got all your major land masses, and most of the races you can play as correlate roughly with one of those land masses. Now, there are obviously some exceptions in there that we'll get to in a moment. The most obvious one to start with is the Empire. It's just the Holy Roman Empire in the Renaissance, and instead of pretending to fight zombies and werewolves, they're actually fighting zombies and werewolves. And it's important to note that werewolf trials and witch hunts and all that were a very real problem in the Holy Roman Empire of the 1500s. This is something they were already obsessed with. So this idea of a culture that is constantly seeking to root out heresy within its midst is very historical, to say the least. And not only that, the actual division of the government itself, the idea of an emperor on top and princes beneath him, in this case called elector counts. The emperor was not all-powerful. He had to basically refer back to these guys to maintain his power, which is a really cool representation of that in the game, actually. Now, to the west, you're going to find Bretonnia, which in this case is pretty much medieval France, with a little bit of England thrown in, but very much just the Arthurian legends of the 1300s. Lots of heavy cavalry, lots of longbows, and if you know anything about history, that's basically combining France and England together, to say the least. They even throw in a Lady of the Lake just to make sure to drive home that Arthurian legend point. It's very chivalric. It's basically the ideal version of France and England of the High Middle Ages. Now, you'll notice I did throw England in there because England technically isn't represented in the game, even though this game itself was made in England. There is a tiny island to the north called Albion, the historic name of England, but in the lore it's actually inhabited by basically Iron Age Celtic tribes with lots of additional bog monsters and giants walking around. Very druid heavy. Now, it is possible that we may eventually see that as a DLC, but it would be very, very far in the future, to say the least. To the far east, you'll find Kislev, which is heavily influenced by Poland, Lithuania. There's also a nice, stylistic splash of the Scandinavian Rus thrown in. I mean, you only have to look at the architecture there to get the idea of St. Basil's Church in Moscow. The armies themselves are also historical. Their most famous unit is the Winged Bear Cavalry, which are based on the famous Winged Hussars, a great cavalry force. Hopefully we'll get to see them in Total War Warhammer in the future. It's fun, historically inspired culture. To the south, in what we would call Spain and Italy, you will find the Border Princes, which wield armies yet again from roughly the Renaissance era. A lot of pike and shot heavy, and expected to probably make an appearance in Total War Warhammer in the future as the Dogs of War DLC, which themselves are based on the Condottieri, which are Italian mercenaries from the Renaissance period. Basically, Italy was so small that they couldn't wield huge armies, so instead they had a lot of money, so they would hire outside people to kind of fight between them. And that's really it as far as the really easy to tell ones go. These are all the human races, which are pretty straightforward. Now, in the far distant east, you do have Cathay, Ind, and Nippon, which are based on China, India, and Japan, theoretically, but they've never actually been fleshed out in the Warhammer manuals, and they probably, barring some sort of crazy expansion, will never actually appear in the Warhammer games. There's just not enough known about them, although they are all based on the mythology of the locations, which is pretty cool, and I would very much like to see them. And the same thing goes for Araby in the far south, yet again based on sort of an Arabian Nights sort of feel with lots of genies and flying carpets and stuff like that. So from here on, it's a lot more speculation, but there's still nice little nuggets of history to them. Now, the dwarves are something of a conundrum. Obviously, these guys are Tolkien-esque, definitely draw upon the mythology as put forward in Lord of the Rings, but here they're presented as Scottish, basically, with very thick Scottish accents, with very heavy industrialized economy based on invention and crafting, which is very odd and very specific. And I can't help but wonder, why are they Scottish? I mean, dwarves themselves obviously are from Norse mythology. While they were also presented as master blacksmith and craftsmen in Norse mythology, and also very strong-willed, and the dwarves here do maintain that tradition of craftsmanship and strong will from the original Norse sagas, but the accent still is sort of an odd choice. And all I can really come up with to explain that is that Scotland hosted the Vikings for a very long time. If you've played Thrones of Britannia, you know what I'm talking about. Scotland is also very clannish, much like the Dwarfs, and has a strong, we'll say, passion for drink. Scotland also, interestingly, has a long history of inventors and engineers. Alexander Graham Bell, Scottish. And curiously, both armies also prefer to fight on foot. Scotland in the Middle Ages especially was famous for basically not using cavalry or archers or anything else. It was always about strong infantry formations with the schiltron. Beyond all this, I think the reason that they made the Dwarfs Scottish is because Swedish and Norwegian accents sound a bit silly in English. And when you talk about dwarves, you gotta talk about greenskins, otherwise known as orcs, but they can't say that for copyright reasons. Now, the orcs in this world are very, let's just say, orky. Big, green, mean, and lots of spikes. But they did something a little different. They gave them this crazy sort of English football hooligan accent. And it's it's a good joke. And knowing that this game was made in the 1980s in Britain during the height of the hooligans and the skinheads and all that, it definitely kind of, you can see where they took that and instilled it back into that culture. Now, the other major enemy you're going to find on the old continent is the Skaven, or the Skaven, depending how you want to say it. The idea of large ratmen has been with humans for a very, very long time. You know, just think about the Black Death. I mean, if you look at pictures of the Danse Macabre, what do you see? Rats around people's feet. Even before we knew the Black Death was caused by rats, we still feared them in some way. Just think about the 1980s, the Rouse, the rodent of unusual size. This idea of these huge rats attacking people. It's always just, you know, something we feared. And for good reason. In the trenches of World War I, basically rats would overrun the trenches, feasting on corpses, and they would always start with the eyes, which, let's be honest here, is a really terrifying thing to know or see. Gulliver's Travels actually had giant rats in it. The Nutcracker Suite has a giant rat king, so that goes a long way to explain our fear of them. But you'll notice in-game that specifically that the Skaven are presented as sort of magical, crazy engineers. There's definitely a touch of witchcraft about them. And I really think that actually comes from the medieval Rat King. Now, if you're unaware of what a Rat King was, basically it's rats, multiple rats joined together by the tail, which is naturally occurring. Basically, rats born together in a nest have a chance of becoming tangled together at the tail and become sort of like a giant conjoined rat creature, which was a huge sign of evil magic. And that kind of evil magic idea, I think, is really what drives that race right there. The Tomb Kings are probably one of the easiest to figure out. I mean, they're just ancient Egypt. Literally, it's ancient Egypt. Everything about them. Just, you know, not like Cleopatra's Egypt. This is back in the Old Kingdom where people building pyramids and, you know, they're using slaves to do it. Not only are these guys coming back from the dead, they're bringing everybody they know with them, which is kind of fun. Now, on the distant end of the continent, in the far blistering north, you will find Norsca and the Warriors of Chaos. These are basically Vikings. Now, I know what you're thinking, Vikings don't have horns. Well, that's because these are heavy metal Vikings. Remember, 1980s, ladies and gentlemen. These are the Vikings that rock out to Led Zeppelin's Foreigner song every time it comes on, and probably listen to death metal as well. The other major inhabitants of not Europe is the Vampire Counts. Positioned in what is not Transylvania, Hungary, they are drawn from the Dracula myth of Bram Stoker, which itself was based on an actual guy, Vlad Tepes, who was a king in the area who used extreme measures to try and fight back the encroaching Ottoman Empire. His father had done the same thing before him and had earned the coveted St. George's knighthood, making him part of the Order of the Dragon, which in Hungarian is called Dragul, which made him Vlad Dragula, which is the son of the dragon. And obviously a lot of culture has been thrown on top of that through the years of vampire mythology, you know, how it works with the undead thralls and stuff beneath them. But they're still very much based in that sort of very dark Eastern European world of forest and haunting. Mixed up in all this, you'll find the Beastmen, which is a ragtag collection of all your mythological forest monsters. You got your fauns, your satyrs, your minotaurs, throw in a couple of giants, get even a harpy or two in there. Now, obviously these guys are pulled from the various mythologies of Europe, but beyond that, they also represent sort of the pagan tribes of the Roman period. They're just that generic barbarian that went from place to place and sort of burned things down and seemed to have no concept of actual society from the, quote, civilized perspective. Based on the Germanic tribes who fought Rome, with a bit of Huns in there, I suspect. I mean, literally, they're horsemen. I mean, you can't get more Hunnish than that. And speaking of the Huns, far out beyond the Black Mountains, you'll find things like the Ogre Kingdoms, based on the Mongols. Except, what if the Mongols were 30-foot tall monsters? You'll notice the big mustaches and the type of armor and hat, which basically give them away right there. But yet again, this idea of the bloodthirsty hordes coming from nowhere. As an extension of that, you'll find the daemons and gods of chaos, which are a combination of like Lovecraftian elder gods, old ones, and Christian pagan myths. Demons that have tormented the living and twisted their bodies and shapes. Now, if we scoot across the ocean to the New World, we'll find the Lizardmen, which is highly influenced by Aztec and Mayan society. You literally have a priest king on top and lots of his servants beneath him that all work towards creating that larger, higher good. The architecture is so clearly Mesoamerican, even the symbology and the types of headdresses they're wearing. Now, making them dinosaurs was a stroke of stinking genius. It's also interesting to note that early stories by the authors like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle actually suspected that there were still dinosaurs living in these deep, dark jungles in Africa and South America. So it's an interesting little footnote right there that may have inspired this idea of the lizard Mayans. Now, obviously, I've been avoiding the 2-ton white lion in the room, which is the elves. Everything we know about modern elves is obviously drawn from Tolkien, and Warhammer is no exception. Now, how they're handled here I actually think is really interesting. The elves divided into 3 groups. You have your high elves, your dark elves, and your wood elves, each with their own specific sort of feel. So we'll start off with the high elves because back in the day they were all theoretically high elves. The world is basically Atlantis. You'll even notice they're out past the Pillars of Hercules. If you ever read the description from Plato, it's a giant circular continent with a port in the middle. And it keeps with the Tolkien idea of a great kingdom now fallen. The accents is very British, so you have a bit of a throwback right there. But beyond the visuals, I think there's interesting parallels with 1500s and 1600s France here. There's a concentration on court politics. The name of their leader is the Phoenix King, which definitely parallels the Sun King. And this sort of underlying what I'll call haughtiness and disdain. This sort of we're above it all, this idea of a culture that is the center of the world that all must look to. It's very sort of Enlightenment France. And also because of that, it makes the Dark Elves far more interesting. Now, the Dark Elves broke off and when they started worshipping the dark arts, and France itself has something of an interesting history with this. Just think about the Marquis de Sade and guys like Bluebeard, France's Gilles de Rais, one of the companions of Joan of Arc, who famously communicated with a demon and struck a bargain where he killed something like 200 people to start to study the dark arts. There's always this sort of underlying current of evil energy, and it's interesting to see that as if it had taken over a section and they had broken off. Very cool. Now, the other version of that is obviously the Wood Elves, which is a bunch of hippies living in the forest. Wood Elves are sort of the embodiment of primordial man, almost as if they're a stereotypical version of Native Americans or someone else living in harmony with nature. And because of that, they also draw upon the forest spirits themselves. I mean, their leader is Orion, one of the traditional elven forest spirits of the old world. So they have Ints, giant tree people, which harkens back to the Green Man of Celtic mythology and this idea of this forest spirit and guardian. And that should be everybody. Now, I realize this is a bit of a tour all over the world right there, but I just wanted to point out some of the interesting kind of historical footnotes behind a lot of these cultures, because there's definitely something there. And if you've never really been engaged by history before, I actually think Warhammer is an interesting footnotes version of it to introduce people. You get a good idea for the flavor of the lands, much like 300 gives you a good idea of the flavor of the Spartans. It may not be good history, but it'll at least get you interested and maybe even crack open a book sometime. So how do you think I did? Is my historical analysis on point, or did I miss something important? Make sure to leave a comment below and weigh in. I'd be curious what you guys think. And as always, thanks for watching.